I'll call our EDA meeting to order. Karen, could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Roberts.
Here.
Commissioner Huntosh.
Here.
Commissioner Husnick. Commissioner Finneman.
Here.
Commissioner Lorge. Here. And Commissioner Erickson. And President Bain.
Here. I'd like to invite everyone to rise and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance. Members of the EDA, you have an agenda before you. I will entertain a motion to approve.
I would move to approve.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Oppose? And our agenda is approved. First item this evening is to approve the minutes from our regular EDA meeting of October 11th, 2021. Is there a motion or any changes?
I move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye. Oppose? Any abstentions?
Abstain.
One abstention. Member
Another.
Roberts.
Abstain.
And also Member Huntosh. Two abstentions. Karen, you got that?
I got it.
Perfect. Next item is our minutes from our EDA Downtown Committee Workshop, which is from October 25th, 2021. And I will entertain a motion to approve.
I move we approve.
I'll second.
And a motion and a second. All those in favor signal by saying aye. Oppose? Any abstentions? All right, minutes are approved. Our next item is the Forest Chamber of Commerce 2022 BRNE Agreement. And Dan, do you want to start us on this?
I do. President, members of the EDA, before United is sort of having a conversation tonight about what the BRNE agreement looks like for 22 and moving forward. To provide a little bit of background on it, at the last meeting, October 25th, Nanette from the Chamber of Commerce gave the EDA an update on the work done to date. So she gave kind of the update on the work that was completed in 2021 as it pertains to the BRNE agreement. The original term that we had assigned to this BRNE agreement was a one-year term. If you look back at the agreement, actually some of that agreement was for work that had already been completed back in 20, because the conversation for this really started in 20. In about November, about a year ago from about today, we started talking about what the agreement looks like moving forward. So we signed a kind of a retroactive 20 and a proactive 21 agreement. So we had the one-year term. That expires at the end of this year. So before you tonight is sort of the a desire to have that conversation about what do we want to have this agreement look like for 22 and moving forward into the future. Kind of my thought for the approach for tonight's conversation is to look at this sort of in three different sections. First is to look at the term. There's been some previous conversations on length of agreement. And then the second one would be to sort of bundle together the payment, the total cost of the contract with the services rendered, since those two really do go hand in hand. And then the third portion of this would be sort of looking at anything else inside that agreement outside of that we want to change. So as a starting point, I want to bring up just the idea of the term. I'm looking for feedback from the EDA is, do we want to continue with a one-year term, or do we want to extend that out for a multiple year, let's say a two-year term? From a staff's perspective, for this next renewal, when I looked at how much we've changed the agreement already, there's been some changes from just November through this 1 year. Is keeping it at a one-year term allows for that flexibility without having to sort of bake in other openers within the contract to say, we're going to review annually and change the work plan. We can sort of review this on an annual basis. Another thing to consider as we look at the term for near future here is we're also right now in the market for a community development director, and don't necessarily want to have that person come on board with an EDA or BRNE agreement that's multiple years. If they have a different vision, they want something added to it, they want to make a change, it might be tougher if we have a multiple year agreement. But conversely, having a 2-year agreement gives us some budget assurance, gives us some kind of continuity there. So that's sort of the conversation points, just to kind of start that conversation on the term of the agreement. And with that, I'll just turn it over for feedback on term.
Thank you, Dan. Just open it up. Member Finneman.
I believe I asked last time if Nanette would look at that as a troublesome thing to have a 1 year. I can understand your reasoning, but it's also tough to tie it down to a single year. And you can anticipate and plan and do more if you had a longer period of time to count on. I defer to you.
Thank you, Councilman Finneman.
Yeah.
And, as I looked at and looked more specifically at the agreement, I see that, they are in pretty general terms. And so there was just, before you, when you get to the changes in the agreement, they're pretty broad and pretty general. So I don't find an issue with a couple-year agreement at all at this point, because, again, the scope of the work is pretty general-based, and we can get more specific as we have conversations.
As we restrict you to 1 year, that's workable. Okay.
Other points of feedback or questions related to the
Well,
term?
I think Dan's point of having this new position coming on board, it begs to just do 1 year.
Any other points on 1 year, multiple year?
I think if Nan likes the 1 year, that's going to work for the chamber, and with the new person coming on board, that makes the most sense.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. If there was, a lot of motivation to do multiple year, I could also support a multiple year agreement as long as we specifically spelled out a timeline when we were going to put together a very specific work plan, or a more specific work plan. As, Nan mentioned, the services listed are fairly general. And there is kind of an operating work plan that is kind of the next layer of tactical detail. And so, I think it's that layer of detail that a future community development director will have the most input on. But if 1 year is kind of the next, it makes more sense to have a bridge, I'm happy to support either. I'm not sure I have strong feelings either way. So it sounds like commitment to the relationship long-term, and that's my only other concern on just having a 1 year agreement, is it doesn't, reflect a long-term commitment. But as long as there's a mutual understanding that there is long-term commitment, maybe a 1 year agreement makes sense for this next timeline.
Yeah, I think to echo that point, I think the desire with the 1 year term isn't to cut this off in a year. I think it just more allows the flexibility of, next November versus having to try to reopen a contract and go through that sort of gymnastics. You can just basically say, let's drop items A, B, and C and replace those with these new ones and adjust the term and flow as that. It's more flexible, especially as we sort of re-enter this and kind of see where everything is in terms of, the return on the investment that we're making in this contract. So switching gears a little bit, kind of the next phase of this will be looking at the amount or the payment, and then also the services rendered. So current contract amount is we pay $5,000 annually in two payments of $2,500 each. When I looked at the budget for 2022, we do have that funding level of $5,000 that's continued for next year's budget. But there had been some conversation as of at the last meeting, at the end of last meeting, is do we want to look at increasing that in next year's budget? Do we want to add more to this contract? If we do add more in terms of payment, I'd also recommend we add more services as well. But I think this sort of becomes that spot in the agreement where we have to make sure that we're cognizant of the time demands that Nanette has, that this is not something we want to bog her down with. We'll give her X amount of dollars, but then add 5 more things to that becomes too burdensome for her, and we monopolize her time too much. So it's sort of that balancing act between what do they need to operate versus what are we getting back on the return. So it's sort of having to strike that balance. But I figured combining those two together versus talking about payment, because you want to have payment in context of terms. So we have the $5,000 that we currently pay, and for that you see the services that are listed out in the agreement. You have items A through A through L that are currently listed there. I do have a couple of small word changes that were suggested by Nanette. Those are listed in red in the agreement. One of them is for item C. So here we started last year looking at specifically having language related to actually going out and doing BRNE surveys for the restaurant and retail sector. Since we don't have an actual BRNE survey scheduled for '22, we're looking to change that to say Forest Lake Area Chamber of Commerce supports the BRNE efforts of the Forest Lake EDA, making that a little bit more of a generic statement versus a very specific that we have currently in the agreement. Item I, which is currently worded as Forest Lake Area Chamber support the City of Forest Lake tree lighting event. Instead of that making a very specific event, we're looking at staff recommending making that change to the Forest Lake Area Chamber partners with the City of Forest Lake for a minimum of one city-sponsored community event or program annually. That allows some flexibility where we're not just saying it's tree lighting. We can say the bigger need may be for event X or a new event comes online. We can sort of be flexible, work with the chamber to figure out what that event is and work with the chamber to get that promotion to happen. And then also, the chamber also suggested adding in language that the Forest Lake Area Chamber of Commerce and the City of Forest Lake staff continue to look for opportunities to collaborate. We're already doing this sort of naturally as part of the Net and I's relationship, but this sort of more formalizes that as part of this agreement. So that's sort of the starting points for conversation on the agreement. And with that, I'd be happy to open it up for if there's anything that we're missing, anything that we need change. This is the opportunity to really kind of dive into those deliverables or those goalposts for what this agreement looks like for '22.
I'm sorry, I missed the first one. The second one was I for the tree lighting. What was the first?
The first one is item C, which is pertaining to BRNE within the city. So we currently had it listed last year as the net was going to do the retail and restaurant sectors of the BRNE surveys. But since we don't have that work scheduled for next year, we're looking at making that just, the chamber will kind of umbrella support our BRNE activities next year without having specifically saying, you're going to go do survey work for us. So it's more of a generalization there.
Given, I just want to make sure I understand also the nature of the conversations you and Nanette have had already, Dan. Given that scope, is it the recommendation that that scope equates to similar funding amounts? Is that kind of where your conversations have gone so far?
Yeah, I mean, conversations so far, we're not really adding anything dramatic to this one. It's just some more, maybe memorializing a little bit of activities that we're already doing, Nanette and I, Nanette and the city are already doing. And then making just some minor language changes in there so we're not as specific. So allows a little bit more agreement flexibility for both sides.
That makes sense. Members of EDA, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I think 5,000 is little enough, for a city to participate, to help out such a conduit to the public that the chamber is. I hate to throw it back on your shoulders, but and I'm not sure what kind of fortunes you're making off memberships and other things, but it seems to me we're contributing, a little, but not a lot. And I'm not sure what more and how much more would propel you somehow forward, because there's so much to do. That's how I picture the chamber. There's so much to do. 5,000 is a certain amount. You get other funding from elsewhere, but how does it stand? Is there a need you'd like to present here that says 5,000 could be, or 5,000 more could be appreciated?
5,000 more could definitely be appreciated. I think it's no surprise. Blake has brought it up many times that, we're looking to hire. And so, I'm on that tipping point of do I hire, do I not? And extra money definitely helps in at least a part-time person to distribute some of the responsibilities. So definitely, there is need for more workers. I'm just me, as you all know, and so more hands will, just like the city, the same situation that you folks are in. So definitely, our main income comes from membership and then some sponsorship. Primarily, it's membership driven. And I did have a note, one of the things or twice now, we've done some mailings, which do not come inexpensively. We've mailed to the Forest Lake businesses, which I think is a great thing, and it didn't come before this group to ask for additional funds. But we have been reaching out and making sure that all business, not just chamber members, but all businesses knew about the grant programs back in when it was right at the end of the year, beginning of, I think that the county program was in January. I think that's when that went out. And then now we've just done a needs assessment for businesses, kind of looking at what the next level is. And so then I just did another mailing to all businesses, both chamber members and non-chamber members, to make sure that they had an opportunity to see that there was a survey. So those are things, again, that's just a simple thing, but those are another way that I reach out to all businesses. And so additional, that I'm looking at the rough cost there, that's about $2,500 right there, so half of the budget. So
So there are those incremental costs, and they do add up.
yes.
But when you talk about staffing, that's a big jump, isn't it? Can you give us a sense of what that would mean?
What I'm looking, well.
What you would need to staff up part-time or however you might staff up?
Well, for sure, I'd like at least a half-time person, would love a full-time person. There's so much more work that can be done and loosens me up to do what I feel like I would be best at, which is visiting businesses and having conversations and selling memberships or, whatever their need is, right? And so at a minimum, I'd be hoping for a part-time position that's half-time. That's at the very minimal.
Just on the funding level too, if I could just also remind the EDA, when we renegotiated this last year in November, we actually did a fairly sizable increase in from what the original contribution was. So back in 2012, 2013, now granted that's a number of years ago, we were paying $2,500 for a similar level of service. We did double that last year to $5,000, which was the market adjustment on that. So we have, given an increase historically, and I just bring that back in context of the conversation that we did have a year ago in terms of the funding level for this agreement.
And we don't have any sort of cost share agreement on any of the direct expense items related to the program?
We do not. I mean,
Currently?
at this point, it's just sort of, we didn't dive into the level of cost share. I believe the agreement says if there's a specific program like, a mailer that they're responsible for, the fees associated with that. But I don't believe we have a cost share in our current agreement.
Is it a prospect? Is it a prospect, a possibility?
To do a cost share?
Yes, I mean, we're Forest Lake Area Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, yes. I mean, you'd have to take a look, though. You'd have to make sure from, the chamber also serves areas outside of Forest Lake, the boundary of Forest Lake, and you want to make sure that you're not targeting businesses outside of the boundaries of Forest Lake for a business support. So there's a little bit of, you have to fine tune that a little bit just to make sure you're hitting your right market share. But, that being said, we've done some every door direct mailers within the city that just as a result of pulling in that zip code, you do hit a couple that are in Columbus. There's no way to break that out, and it's actually less expensive to kind of do the broad hit versus trying to carve out that 15 or 20 addresses that are out there. So you could, add a cost share perspective in there, but you want to put a cap on what that budget contribution would be, so you're not sort of opening yourself up to, every sort of marketing or, mailer that's going to take place over the course of a year.
Jenny?
Do we know if other cities help fund their Chamber of Commerce's?
Yes, they do.
Like, to what extent, what percentage?
That I do not know.
Yeah, and there's as far as I recall, there's a state law, you can't provide direct support through membership. You have to do it through marketing, so you can't just, or an agreement like we have here for BRNE. She's providing, the chamber here is providing a specific set of services for the city that pertain to something that we don't have current staffing levels to support these efforts for. So it has to go down through, there are certain pathways that you have to follow, but I think everything that's been discussed so far tonight falls within those spending parameters, so they would be allowed.
Well, you hear something like Nan just said about, chewing up half her budget just for some mailings that had to take place. I mean, it has an impact. I react to that, and I think, is it so difficult to talk about a slightly different amount than 5? I know you have arguments for what works and what doesn't work outside of what realms and what issues have to be dealt with, but I have no argument to upping the ante if other people feel the same as I do.
So just, would it make sense to table this just for a moment and go through the actual budget to see what maybe we have, if there is ability, maybe we're maxed out and that it's not even a question for us to be able to entertain, I guess.
Yeah, we can definitely do that, because I do have an update on the budget as well. So I mean, and again, it was sort of like, I looked at trying to sequence these two as like, what's the way, there's not really a good way to sequence them. So I can definitely jump into the budget update, give that ideas. You have some ideas of where we are from a 2022 budget perspective as well.
If that makes sense
Yeah,
for
yeah.
everyone else,
Is-
it doesn't, I'm just suggesting that.
I think that is a smart suggestion. Is there any other burning questions before we transition to budget? All right, I like the idea. Let's have a budget discussion and then circle back.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit to the budget update. So back in August, we met and sort of did some initial budget, kind of threw some numbers together for the initial 2022 budget. Main sort of difference between 21's budget and 22's budget is the increase from 50,000 to 150,000. And at the time, there was some conversation of how is this going to work in context of the overall budget? How's that going to look in terms of, once council sees it in context of general fund, that's a pretty sizable increase in EDA. What's it going to look like when they kind of go through those initial budget conversations? This has been discussed at the council level, and there's been no suggested changes to the EDA budget. So they've looked at it, and at this point, it's still being proposed at 150,000, and it seems to be, we haven't heard anything that says we need to reduce that or change that amount. So at this point, we're proceeding with a anticipated budget for 22 of 150,000. That being said, what I put together in August, there was some placeholder dollars that were put in there. I mean, obviously, August is a number of months away from 22. Some of the things that we were looking at putting in the 22, I needed to get a little bit clearer picture as to where we actually were going to be for 22, and I do have some updates on those numbers in terms of how we sort of shift the funds within sort of those categories that were presented back in August. So I'll go through those and just give a high level of each one of those. So back in August, I proposed an initial $16,250 in operations. Now, operations is basically EDA salaries, legal, engineering, just overall operational expenses for the EDA. I did do a little bit of an increase in there of $1,250, just to, when I looked at where we kind of were tracking from a budget perspective, just did a little bit of an increase in there to make sure that we're, IC project is a little bit higher than what I proposed back in August, so I made a slight adjustment there. On the downtown incentive, I proposed a pretty significant increase in this to 30,000 back in August. Made no changes to that for the November update. Main reason here is we're expanding the area that's allowed for the downtown incentive and also doing this graduated scale for 22. So want to make sure that have enough funds available so when those demands come in or the anticipated increase in demand comes in, we're able to fund those downtown incentive programs. And then as well as if we don't fully spend all that downtown incentive funds next year, we can use those excess funds to start building up reserves. So if we do have a larger project, when those larger projects come in, we have cash on hand that we can then support those if they need some type of incentive package to land in Forest Lake. So we're kind of building up the war chest, so to speak. So when those incentive asks come forward, we are funded to allow those to happen. On the employee side, this is one that's probably had the most significant change from August till now. When we first discussed this back in August, basically what was in there was a placeholder amount for a full-time employee starting approximately mid-year. So looking about a mid-July start in 22. Looking at now that we currently are in the market for a community development director. So City Council did authorize the position for the community development director. A copy of that position description is in the EDA package, just so everybody's aware of the position description. We are actively in the market right now doing a recruitment for that position. And then as a result, we had to do an increase in budget here to account for the EDA's portion of the community development director's salary. So we had to increase it from $43,750 to $60,000. So that's allows for the full year, and that's the EDA's contribution, because this will be funded out of EDA and out of general fund. So there's going to be a funding split. So the EDA's portion is $60,000. So there's a pretty sizable increase there to allow for that full year position there. On the planning side, these are the downtown planning costs. I did a placeholder of $25,000 back in August, looking at what had been completed to date versus what was remaining. In the interim, I've reached out to Bruce a number of times, and I kind of was like, where are we looking at for 22's overview or expenses? We actually reduced that down to 20. He thinks we're gonna have about 20,000 worth of work to wrap up the project in 22. So that was able to be reduced. I took that excess 5,000 and then rolled that up into the community development director or the employee position. Contract services, I did an increase here from 10,000, which was proposed in August, up to 15,000. This was based on the feedback we got from the Incipio study at the last EDA meeting when Jeff was here and proposed the Incipio study. The cost of that study is 20,000, and wanted to account for the city's local share. If we were able to get a Washington County pre-development grant fund grant for that, that would require a one-to-one match. So we would need $10,000 to account for that. And then also have the $5,000 here for the chamber agreement. So the chamber agreement and the Incipio study are what I have here in contract services. So that right now is currently being held at 15,000 for next year. The downtown plan execution, this is probably the one line item that got the biggest hit when I had to sort of reallocate funds based on the updates in August. Had originally put $25,000 here to sort of allow us to move from a planning foothold after Q1 into that execution execution stand for the remainder of 22, so we don't lose a full budget year, because the fear was we complete the plan in early 22, no funds are available, have to shelve it for a full year before we can start doing a plan. Wanted to at least have some capital there that we could start executing on that plan. But here, kind of given the new lay of the land in terms of the community development director, those funds had to come from somewhere. So I did reduce the downtown, the amount allocated to downtown plan execution from 25,000 down to 7,500. If we do identify a program though, or a plan that isn't on top of that 7,500, we do have some fund balance that we could tap into so we're not totally at a disadvantage in terms of an execution standpoint next year. We just aren't gonna probably be able to tackle as probably robust of a project on the onset. One thing that we can look at in 22 for 23's budget is that we will have the CIP plan that accompanies the downtown plan. That's not done yet, so it was sort of a guess in terms of where we're gonna be from a capital standpoint, in 22. I don't think this eliminates us from doing projects. It just sort of minimizes what we can do from a project standpoint in 22 in terms of the downtown plan. So that's basically how I had to reallocate the numbers there to get us back up to that 150. So as you can see, the contract services, if we go forward with the Incipio study and the chamber agreement, that is the bulk of our contract services. If we make adjustments there, we could probably pull some from the downtown execution standpoint, but then we're getting pretty thin in terms of what projects we can do there. Or we could reduce downtown incentive, a little bit there as well. But that's sort of the starting point. That's sort of the update that we have here in November based on the 2022's budget, based on some updated numbers.
Dan, what is our balance for 2021 that we haven't used and that's not allocated?
Right now, I want to say it's off the top of my head, it's right around 100,000 that's remaining. We dropped fund balance down to pay for the license, with the license fee, for 22 for liquor license. We reimbursed, so they did not charge for those. So we reimbursed general fund out of EDA. So that was a pretty sizable reduction there. And then we also have some local share costs for the planning too that were a little higher than the original budget for 21, so that's drawing down our fund balance a little bit as well. But we should also see some reimbursements from the Washington County grant on our planning activities. So I'd say all in, you're probably right around 100,000 plus or minus a little bit on there from a fund
So
balance
that
standpoint.
100,000 is over and above this?
Correct. So that's basically one way to look at that, sort of the savings account for the EDA. This is your checking account for the EDA. So this
Gotcha.
is our operational budget. And with the downtown incentive, we sort of have a built-in item that if we don't fully spend that, we can build up that savings balance. So when we do have a larger project come in that may require some incentive to land here, we have cash on hand ready to go for those projects.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
the Incipio contractor potential, I guess we've never, we had that formal presentation, but we haven't talked about it as a group. So I don't know how to really make a decision whether we want to spend that money until we, I guess as a group, decide if that's something we want to do.
And I think at this point, it's just a placeholder to reserve funding should we want to go down that path. And if it's not the Excipio study, we do have a history of doing other studies, and so I think it's, by Dan, correct me, but we're not earmarking anything specifically for Excipio in
Correct.
approving the budget. It's just it's under the contract services umbrella.
Then the other, so then that, so we have a study, that we're in place with the downtown that we've paid $90,000 for or whatever. And we really wanted to earmark some money to execute that plan. And so I'm a little concerned with, placeholding some money for another study when we're still waiting for results for a current study, and then now we're gonna underfund that. Not underfund it, but reduce that significantly. And I understand why, but I guess that's just a bit of concern, just looking at this way and bring that up as a point.
And I think, one thing I looked at too, when you look at this longer term, so 22 is sort of a unique year in terms of a budget standpoint because of the fact that we had carryover planning expenses. So looking forward to 23, now granted, a lot of stuff can change in a full year, so I mean, we're not committed to this, but the thought would be potentially one thing that you could do for 23 is if you slightly underfund downtown planning execution in 22, you have a $20,000 planning expense that won't be there for 23, then you could reallocate, and you also would have the CIP, so you have a known set of projects that you can do from a local standpoint. The downtown plan execution was probably the toughest one to predict because I don't have the list of projects to deal with. I don't have an idea of, are these going to be, is it $2 million worth of infrastructure improvements that we're going to have in there on the public side, or is it 50 grand? I don't know at this point. So it was sort of like kind of throwing a dart at a wall. But to your point is, we will have for 23, we'll have a better foothold as the execution standpoint, in terms of downtown plan. I did at least initially have a conversation with Bruce, and I said, I know you're probably seeing some low-hanging fruit from a planning standpoint, some relatively low-cost, high-reward projects, and I can circle back with him on the amount that we need there, because we may be a little bit under with that 7,500, but we do also have some fund balance that we could also potentially draw on for a one-time project, to make up that difference for 22, and then in 23, take that planning, and then we look at, you potentially have 27.5 if we don't make any changes to overall levy, which then you can start to really knock off some pretty significant projects in the downtown area.
Well, I think we have the capital behind it all with the reserve fund to not worry too much about what we're doing here right now on this line item.
Correct, there's capital behind it, but the fear is you don't want to overextend your capital every year by drawing that down like we did last year, because at a certain point, if you're not going to replenish those reserves, your capital goes, and to be frank, I mean, a large project that requires a lot of incentive, if you look at other EDA balances, they carry a lot of capital around just for that time when, the stars align and the project comes in. If you need to do, one-time expense, those funds can go quickly to land that larger project in town. So just full disclosure on that as well.
I think 2022 is challenging. The downtown plan isn't done, and so we don't have the lineup of those potential projects. We don't understand which of those projects are going to be sequenced when and what the quantity of the low-hanging fruit. So I would advocate that we try to keep as many options open as we can, and make those decisions as information becomes known, which I don't think is going to happen between now and the end of the year. And I agree with Blake's point on the concern around, the downtown plan execution looks like it might be light, but I suspect that number could be triple what we have right now, and we might also say it might be light, because I think there's just I'm not expecting that to be a small number that comes out of the downtown plan, and it's going to take some time for us to work through what are the sources of funds to meet those needs? And so I guess kind of bringing this back to what does that mean for other studies we might do or other services we might purchase, in particular tonight, the conversation happens to be with the chamber. Unless there's like a specific identified need of how we should increase, I would recommend that we stay steady, keep all of our options on the table, again, because I think we're going to have a lot more as the plan, that downtown plan comes together. And I think we're gonna want as many options on the table and as possible. If there were a burning need item that we could all identify and needed to be added on to the chamber, I'm happy to support that and to consider an increase in funds. But without that burning item being identified, I think kind of stable funding levels make sense, and then we can evaluate once we have the downtown plan. Just kind of where I'm at.
And also too, you have another, with the downtown incentive, that also is it's an anticipated placeholder for what we're gonna see from a demand perspective. I don't have a lot of data to forecast that off of, unfortunately, so it's a little bit looking at where we were from a, project standpoint historically, and then looking at the expansion, it's sort of like, I think that number will be fairly good, but we could also see that, businesses aren't doing a lot of capital improvements next year, so we may see that the request, be reduced. So then again, there's some movement that can happen there as well. So I think there's a few spots in here that the numbers can shift and move around a little bit for 22, and set up a pretty decent 23 budget again from a downtown execution standpoint as well.
Go ahead.
I think we ought to talk about the chamber's ability to come back if there is a project, because the chamber has momentum. It's got the ear of the businesses. We're moving forward. We're getting things done. Incipio, other studies, they're years off. Why are we going to shut off the momentum and funding the momentum and what we got in place now and carry it forward? We're stopping the train. We want that train to keep going, build up momentum. And Incipio, the other, whatever they are, we start from scratch and listen to them for the next year or so, and then start something. And what happens to the chamber's projects in the meantime, because they're
Please
underfunded?
understand, I'm not suggesting we stop any train. I'm suggesting we continue with what we.
So I think we need to keep open to if the chamber's got, if it needs to be project-based, if the chamber proceeds, sends us a project to fund, we ought to be open to funding that.
If I may kind of provide like maybe a little bit of a pathway to that, in terms of like context of the BRNE agreement, we could, with that collaborative part in there, we could, to that point, do a project specific. So we say there's a specific mailer that goes out for a business survey that's maybe a little bit outside the original scope of the BRNE, but still kind of hooks into it. We could approve that as a separate line item or a separate project and still sort of look at this 5,000 that we're doing with the chamber covers, A through L. That's sort of your day-to-day operational stuff. But then as projects come in, I could work with the chamber. We can work with the chamber and say, this mailer is going to be $3,000. You want to do a cost share on this one, or where do you want a cost share here? Whatever that looks like. Not saying it's a mailer, but whatever those one-off projects are. Because otherwise, we're trying to throw a number at something that may or may not materialize next year, and then what happens if the chamber doesn't do the mailers that are suggested in there, then we're overpaying. So if it's project by project, at least there's a little bit of a gap in there, or a stopgap that we can say, yes, this one, no, this one, and take that in context too of the overall budget as we go through the year.
Is there anticipated in the 2020 work plan, you mentioned the cost and high costs related to mailing expenses. Is there for the 2022 work plan, is there a mailer that's anticipated as part of that?
Hopefully not. I look at the grant program. That one was pretty pertinent, to be able to get that out there. And then the survey work has been done. So again, we do anticipate that there'll probably be a secondary surveying needed. We did get good response and just a ton of feedback on the business needs assessment. And this is all futuristic So again, I just looked at it today and haven't really deciphered it, but I could see that there might be an additional need for survey, in follow-up with that. So that would be the biggest thing, I guess, because we're looking, and again, Chris Ang had mentioned that we're working with Washington County to create and hopefully develop a program that is need-based for more expansion, taking our businesses, not new business, because we have open to business for that, but creating a secondary layer for those that are looking to expand and finding resources for them. So, and I think that's an overall great plan for this area, right? So,
Oh, because I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for us to have some sort of an expense reimbursement component to this. I would not, I guess I'm ignorant to mailing costs and just not doing the math on what that means. And so to hear you say that half of our dollars were eaten up in the back costs, I'm expecting the $5,000 to be going towards actual, the program, not the expenses to support the program. And so, if the program is incurring those types of expenses, or if the chamber's incurring those expenses for the program, I think we should consider some sort of an expense reimbursement. Obviously, perhaps that you have to come up with a formula considering, if the mailing's hitting, 75% Forest Lake businesses, maybe it's 75% of the cost or whatever that looks like. But I would be very open to that because again, I don't think that's not the intent of the agreement, is to.
right, yeah, and I understand that, and again, at the end of the day, the chamber work is the chamber work, and so when I'm when I'm making a decision, I'm going to go what's best for business, and so. But because you ask, I'm going to be quite frank with you, and that's not the cost of the mailing list. I will just preface it and say that the mailing that we did do, I purposely separated out by county because we actually fall into 3 counties, and so they're separated out. So with the Washington County, that's again probably 95% Forest Lake with a couple over in Scandia. So again. But then when you're on the other side of the freeway, that's Anoka County. And so I did be mindful of that in the process of creating the mailings, is to separate those so that I could track it for Mr. Undum over there.
And I think to that point, if you look at item 4, in the agreement, it does say the Forest Lake Area Chamber of Commerce shall be responsible for out-of-pocket expenses, including postage and telephone expenses incurred by it in providing services to the city and the EDA. We could change that to add a cost share perspective in there, cap it at a dollar amount, so then our exposure is only X, but then we're working to sort of reimburse some of those expenses,
I would like that you're able to use whatever means of communication is most effective. And if that's a mailing, let's do it because that's most effective. But I also think then we should share in some of those costs rather than have the chamber incur all of it.
I appreciate
And that was my question. How effective are the mailings?
Well, and again, I look at it, this is how I look at it. Every time that I touch a business, whether they respond or not, is a touch. Right. And they know we're out there. And, so again, it's not always results based. It's how many times you touch before they say, oh, I have interest in this, that, or the other thing. And so again, that's how I measure it because, they might not respond the first time. And the big thing too is when we were looking at the city grant program, right, I had people that did not know about it. And so when it came up the next time, I'm like, I'm not going to bear that burden of, hey, I didn't know. And so for non-chamber members, the mailing is really the best. I mean, it's the only option that I have. And it is specific. So it is business specific. It gets addressed to them. It's not an EDDM. With the chamber members, again, I don't have to do quite as much because I'm communicating with them on a regular basis if they open their email. So it's a little bit different situation. So.
Dan, do you think you can find wording at the edge of the agreement with the chamber that allows for, it's not just mailing, it might be anything, that allows for additional services in some fashion to be at least discussed and brought forward?
Yeah, we could put something in there where, I didn't dive through line by line the rest of the agreement because it seemed like that seemed to work for us last year. But what I'm hearing here tonight is working language in there that allows for additional projects to come forward, and additional reimbursements to come forward as EDA funds allow, and as, obviously, I think there needs to be a feedback mechanism to make sure EDA is in agreement with what the project is. So it's sort of like a pre-approval process where it's like, we're gonna do a mailer, here's the intent of it. Are we okay with funding this at 50%, 60%, whatever that cost is, and then go ahead and do it? So it's more of a proactive versus a reactive on there, but I think there's enough there's a spot within the agreement that could be added and worded in there, wordsmithed in.
Go ahead, Blake.
So this is more back to general budget.
Yeah.
So on the employee part of this, the 60,000, and maybe I should have read this somewhere, but what is the number that this new position's gonna be, the salary for that new position?
It's a department head salary, so what is it, on 115 to 130, something like that?
I think it's 105 to 131 is the range on it.
And so do you expect that, half the time will be on EDA related?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, what Dan does here with you, he won't be doing any longer.
Dan.
Well, then.
Hey, you set the process up for the next person to take it across the finish line, right?
Yeah, and that's
Good-
why it came.
good
to,
exit strategy.
We
And
suggested this back
Yes.
in August, knowing what you're going to, so that's the good thing. But I know that
Right.
obviously there has been some changes based on, Donovan resigning, and it's a good thing. It's positive. It's what's needed. Just trying to get, clarification how that dollar amount came from. And then what is remind me the levy amount increase at this point as it stands overall for this?
Overall levy,
Yeah.
well, after tonight, it stands at 7.3%.
Okay.
The number as of approved, the percentage increase for the general fund in September, which was the preliminary approval, was
Yeah, when we.
945.
All funds were in the 9.54, something like that. So we've been working towards, rearranging things. Part of that also, the magic is August is really early and we don't get state numbers until October. And so we had some revenue enhancements, but 7 point, whatever I just said, 3 is currently after I talked to the council tonight. So you're getting a preview.
And I think there's maybe some question around the community development director and the relationship with the position with the zoning administrator. There are two anticipated positions to be filled. One would be a replacement to Donovan, but then this is the additional headcount of the community development director. And I don't believe we're expecting any of the plan or Donovan's position to be coming through the EDA budget. It is
Absolutely
only
not.
the community development director, right?
No, it's only the community development director, which will be split between those two responsibilities. And we'll wait for a planning position until the community development gets here, and we can integrate that and see how that works. And until that time, we'll just continue with Bolton and Menka as the contractual planners.
It seemed like when you described the job of the community economic development person, it encompassed everything that Donovan did as well at the start, and until you replace that person, this person will be doing all of that?
No, the community development director, while split between the EDA and the general fund, he'll be responsible for the EDA's function like Dan was doing here. He or she will be doing that. But also as a department head, will be charged in other parts of the community development. Now traditionally, community development directors often have not only planning, zoning, but they also have building, permitting, and Parks and Rec. Right now, we are only giving him or her community development issues, not building, because building's running well. Parks, we're not ready if we decide to do that. But once Donovan left, we've employed a contractual planner through Bolton and Mank to run all the planning and zoning. Actually, we have two that come on 4 days a week. One does most of the development-related materials, such as new housing subdivisions and all that. And the other is doing basically the complaint tracking and some of the zoning and property maintenance issues. So we're still handling that. We will continue to have them do that even after we hire the community development director. Once the community development director gets his or her feet wet, and we will we'll take a look at that planner position again and see what kind of structure that's going to be.
Well, as long as we're covering the base, meanwhile, we're contracting for that
Yes,
service.
yes.
This was, given the description,
Yeah,
the guy was gonna take on an unhealthy load.
well, and it has to be that only because that person is going to be responsible for all
Sure.
that. And whether if he or she hires a planner that doesn't quite live up to it, they're still going to be responsible for living up to it. So that's why it's all in there. It's a very traditional community development director's job description.
Other questions or comments related to the budget? How are we feeling overall comfort level with kind of amounts and current allocation?
I'm comfortable with the allocation as is. Reserve funds and with the changes that will come in the future that we adjust for, we don't seem to be hamstrung.
Yeah,
I would agree.
see some nodding heads. Is there a next step where EDA does do a final approval of budget, and does that come at a future meeting, or is the next step simply at the council level for final approval in December? Is there-
We've never actually brought back a final, like, roll. I mean, we've always sort of just gone through, how we sort of like, what the buckets are gonna be, and then we execute on that based on, assuming council does not make a reduction in overall budget amount. So we've never done a final or formal budget approval here. It's just more recommendation to council, and if council agrees with that overall dollar amount, the buckets kind of stay as is.
Okay, so this will not come back to EDA, but I guess just message of, over the next couple of weeks, if you have some thoughts or some questions, certainly get those to Dan, because we do have time, our meeting in November. If we needed to address something, we could do so before council will be considering final budget, the first meeting in December.
And honestly, every year we sort of go through this, rebucketing, we kind of go through, and if I actually look back over the past 3 years, we're close within those allocations, but there's always been a project that comes up, something that we didn't anticipate, kind of a new study or a new opportunity comes up mid-year so there's always that adjustment that takes place, but at least we know sort of where the guardrails are for '22.
Perfect. Any other items specific to either the agreement with Chamber or the budget update? Right, Dan and Nanette, do you have what you need for next steps?
I do. What I'll do is I'll work with the net to kind of get the language, added in for that sort of the project-specific funding.
Perfect.
We'll get that added in and then get that brought back for December so we can get that, hopefully approved in December so we can have the contract in place for '23. Or excuse me, for '22, sorry. I'm a year off, for '22.
Understood. All right, moving on to our next agenda item then, the retail trade analysis report intro. Dan?
Present members of the EDA, it's sort of like when you have a substitute teacher come in and watch the video. So we have a video tonight on the updated retail trade analysis report. So the city, this was originally introduced, the EDA probably first saw the retail trade report as part of the Humphrey Institute study. When they first came in, that was the one where we started looking at where we pulling retail from, what are our gaps in sort of what we don't, were we underperforming market. We did have the extension service update those numbers using 2019 figures, and tonight is sort of the overview of what they found in the numbers. And if you turn your attention to your screens, I will play the video. And he goes through a fairly good overview as well as a kind of a dive into the numbers. And then this is, again, more just for EDA awareness. There's no formal action needed tonight, just more for the EDA to be aware of. Audio.
Hi, my name is Ryan Pesch. I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota, and I'm here to give you an
Sorry
overview
about
of the
that.
retail trade analysis for the city of Forest Lake. There's a little introduction to this report, as we've done for a number of communities in the past. We use state sales tax data to do an analysis of your community, primarily to understand where the opportunities of different categories in your community, as well as just get a general scorecard about how is our retail and service businesses doing. We do this using state sales tax data that's published by the Department of Revenue. This particular analysis is using 2019 data, which is maybe not the most recent data, or people oftentimes are looking for more recent data, but there's a lag from the end of a fiscal year, about 18 months until the Department of Revenue publishes it. So there's always a bit of a lag in the data. So this is pre-pandemic data, but it gives us a good indication of those trends over time. Some of the data going back to 1990, and more in-depth data from 2003 onward. And what you do is you'll see the trends in the strength of your retail and service sector from that time forward, as well as by individual subcategories organized by NAICS. One important measurement that you'll see in the report is what's called a pull factor. And we do this measurement because it does account for basically consumer changes over time. And it's calculated as the sales per capita in Forest Lake divided by the sales per capita in Minnesota. And for this, we do use taxable sales as opposed to gross sales because they are more reliable. And the way this measure works is doing this ratio in this way. It gives us a sense of whether there's in-shopping or out-shopping happening in the community. So if you're greater than 1, we think it's safe to assume that there's some form of in-shopping coming into your community. And if you're less than 1, there's a proportional amount of out-shopping happening. And so we can look at things category by category as well as the community as a whole. This is from one of the earlier pages in the report, and you'll see over here on the right-hand side the pull factors going back to 2003 for the entire city. So this adds together all retail and service categories to give a sense like, how is Forest Lake overall doing? And what you see here is there was a bit, the pull factor has been relatively consistent between 1.5 and 1.6 ever since 2013. And so the way to read this is that generally you're bringing in 50 to 60% more in sales than you'd expect for the size of your community. I remember the pull factor, because it is sales per capita, sometimes we can have changes in the pull factor, not simply because of the change in the taxable sales in the community, but also by the change in the population. So it's clear that Forest Lake had a kind of a steep increase in its population. Maybe there's some annexation happening from 2003 up until that 2014. It might explain why some of those pull factors got lower and lower from 2003 to 2013, and then increased and then leveled off. But you can look at the taxable sales in this report and see that those have certainly increased as well as the population has increased too. Like I said, in the report you'll see how taxable sales changed by category, and we do have a snapshot of the more recent changes by category, and we see that vehicle parts and sales increased quite dramatically in the last few years that we have data for, as well as eating and drinking establishment. This is a change in sales, in taxable sales in millions. So there's almost $5 million more in taxable sales in eating and drinking establishments, $4 million more in building materials, and a little more than $7 million in taxable sales with vehicles and parts since 2016. You also see in the report that it's broken out. There's some detail in terms of both the pull factor as well as the total sales for each of these subcategories. And one that's extremely important for Forest Lake is your largest category of building materials. So this includes all lumber yards and Lowe's and Home Depots and these types of stores that sell building materials. And that's nearly 30% of all taxable sales in the community. So quite significant. And we see when we calculate as a pull factor, it's a pull factor of about 4.5. So more than 4.5 times more sales than you'd expect in that category. There's a point where we show Forest Lake's pull factor in comparison to other communities, going back in terms of a long trend back to 1990. And you can see there's a kind of steep increase here in Forest Lake up until 2000, but then a sharp decrease and a fairly level pull factor over time. And you can see how you compare to Cambridge and North Branch and Stillwater. So everybody loves to compare themselves to their neighbors. So here's your opportunity to see how you're doing. One last thing to mention in terms of the city report is we do put in something called expected sales, which is a calculation where we're using certainly the pull per capita sales in Minnesota, the population of Forest Lake, much like we do with the pull factor. But we also take into consideration the income of Forest Lake in comparison to the state in index income. And we use what's called a typical pull factor. So we look at the pull factors for communities like you in your size category, and we use that to adjust what would be the expected sales by category. And so really what we're doing here is just a nice opportunity to look for opportunities or gaps in your retail and service sale, your retail and service community as a whole, just by comparing those actual versus the expected. And again, here we see the importance of building materials much higher than we would expect it. Again, compared to how you compare to other communities your size, using this typical pull factor. But there's also some categories that may be worth thinking about as opportunities, such as furniture stores, where it looks like you're underperforming slightly in amusement and recreation, and slightly in repair and maintenance. Lastly, there's an entire report for Washington County, of which Forest Lake is 13% of county sales, certainly a very large county, of which Forest Lake is only a portion. So hopefully that was helpful, just to give you sort of some highlights and to orient you a bit to the report. And so we are here to be your resource. Please contact me with any questions or follow-up at this contact information. So thank you for engaging with the University of Minnesota Extension, and take care.
Again, that was more of just a kind of an introduction to the report. I mean, again, it echoes similar to what we saw with the report from the Humphrey Institute, but at least it's updated. We want to make sure that wasn't a one-off, and we are still seeing some solid trend lines in terms of where we are outperforming market, in terms of what retail sectors. But I think overall, it kind of shows that we do have a very strong retail environment here in the city, and these types of reports and this type of data, when site selectors are looking for sites for retail, they do carry a lot of weight when you go out and say, I can say we're a sub-regional hub, but when I got poll data to support it, that definitely helps keep them engaged, or they're interested more because we have data back, behind those numbers that, we talk about. So
Interesting that we're negative in recreation and leisure. The land of opportunity here for recreation.
right. Yeah, and again, it's also, it echoes to the furniture sales one. It was always one that stuck out when the Humphrey Institute came in. That was the one market segment where they were like, and it was sort of like, had never thought of it from that perspective, but again, it showed up here in this data as well.
Any other?
I've got a question on the curiosity, on the home building supplies, which are Home Depot and Menards. Are the builders in the developments around here buying from them?
You know, I don't think it gets that granular of level, but, you know, I would anticipate, I think a lot of the contractors that maybe they're using this as their spot to purchase their supplies before they go to their job site. So if you look from a contractor perspective, I think a lot of them potentially maybe live a little bit further up 35, out Highway 8, and are coming in. So we're having a pretty big draw from those independent contractors that are coming in. But there also probably is some in purchasing as well that's happening from, builders purchasing materials here because it's close to where the job sites are. So that's a guess. It's just me kind of, again, guessing at it. I don't have the granular level of data where all those sales are coming from.
And that's in comparison with other cities our size, so it wouldn't be well, Finn, you might know this. So the increased cost in materials the past few years, would that be part of this or not? Because it's comparing to other cities.
This sales data actually predates the increase in price from 20. So this is all 19 data because there's a lagging. So this actual also does not incorporate the COVID impact, which it's sort of, it marks 2019. So this is sort of like the last year's normal operations. And it still shows us we're still pulling a lot of, business in. We're not bleeding out, we're pulling in, which is a good spot to be from a region or from an economic standpoint.
Very nice.
Good background information as we think about what holes we might have and how we might fill those or may not be able to. But any other questions for Dan on the report? It's great background information. Thanks, Dan. Move on to city update. Dan or Patrick, anything for EDA this evening?
I just have one quick update. So I attended the MinCar Expo 2 weeks ago. I was at MinCar, and a lot of action, a lot of people coming over. Heard a number of developers say that Forest Lake is becoming a hot market. It was repeated multiple times from both developers and brokers. So we are definitely our name is getting out there, which is a good thing. Also, just want to commend the EDA and all of these studies that we've been doing, the downtown planning, the infrastructure study, the watershed study. When I'm having conversations with developers and even this retail poll data, the fact that we have all this stuff teed up, ready to go, ready to deliver, they are floored. So we have definitely set the table extremely well for development moving forward, because a number of them have said you have all this study of information available, and the fact that the EDAs and Planning Commission and Council are aware of sort of like, especially with the technology corridor, sort of what those projects are. The developers are extremely happy to hear that. So we're in a very good market position right now, and that was solidified by the conversations I had at MinCar. So it was a very good expo.
Good.
And it was nice to be back in person for the first time in 2 years.
Fabulous. Any questions for Dan this evening? Go ahead.
Before who, but, so when, probably just before Donovan had left, we had that joint meeting with Planning Commission, City Council, and lot sizes and that, and I think that was a huge thing, and where are we at with that? There was really no feedback after that, and are we gonna wait for the community development person to come on board, or?
No, we're not waiting for that to happen. What has happened is the Plan Commission Chair, Mr. Gerard, has decided, and gratefully decided, to take that on as a Plan Commission work item. And they are beginning to explore that right now and are requesting information. So they are starting that work and will hopefully be able to make some recommendations shortly. I don't know how long it'll take them, but that's in their purview. That's what they want. They thought it was a good thing to do at the Planning Commission level. So that's who's doing some of the initial studies, and hopefully we'll have back some recommendations after we provide them whatever information they ask for.
We're appreciating Chairman Gerard's new retirement status. That gives him that time. So Any other questions, city update?
Just a reminder, the 22nd of right before Thanksgiving, that Monday, we have an EDA meeting that is downtown plan. I talked to Bruce this morning. He's going to be bringing sort of the first peek at what the downtown plan will look like, so be prepared. This should be a pretty exciting meeting, so the 22nd at 5:30.
Thank you. We don't have Chris here for a Washington County update. Anything else, Nan, from a chamber update?
Yes, I do have a couple of things I wanted to share with you. A few weeks ago, we did honor Ron Vanilli with his closing of Vanilli's by the Lake. So we were able to present him with some appreciation and accolades. So wanted to share that. Today actually launches our Fall for Local, Shop Local campaign, and out of the 14 businesses, 13 are Forest Lake. So lots of social media buzz about shopping local and encouraging folks to get out. And then just wanted to note too that through our discussion on BRNE work, amazingly, I'm collaborating with the City of Forest Lake Park and Rec now with the Hometown Holiday, which we've done before, and then a potential Winter Fest event. So that meeting was just today, so happy to be moving forward on some of that work. And then the last piece, which I did mention, was we'll be digging into the data analysis on the business and needs assessment. And so then I'll be presenting that information, or perhaps it's Chris, but we'll be sharing that information and finalizing the BRNE report in writing.
Fabulous.
That's it. Thank you.
Good. Any questions for Nan this evening? All right. Anything else to come before us?
Does Ryan have anything to share?
Ryan's always got something to share.
I would just echo the amount of development that's out there, and really the only way to stay in the loop on what's all coming or has already been presented is to stay in tune with what's on the planning commission agendas, especially the last one, last two, a lot of stuff's been talked about. There's 5 or 4 major subdivisions right now, and 2 of them already gone through concept review, so that's the stuff that we're talking about here actually moves forward through this winter. This will be more development all at once than you've ever seen in the history of Forest Lake.
Oh,
Some other sites improvements applications have been submitted, so there's some more stuff that's brewing down in the Headwaters area. Recently, the City Council approved a resolution of support with Washington County here presenting for County State Aid Highway 33 or Everton Avenue, the project that's planned for 2024. That step was critical and the point of that project after all the public engagements and several meetings and presentations to the City Council and City Council workshops. From the county, that basically gives the county the next step, go ahead to start in construction plans and property acquisition to be ready for the 2024 project. That'll be a great improvement, obviously safety, traffic-wise, and it'll provide pedestrian facilities on the west side with the trail coming all the way down to 11th Avenue and then all the way up to Broadway and connecting over to the east, or going another block to 19th to connect, so you'll kind of have a big nice loop when it's all said and done. So just a lot of stuff with that, and then previous approved development, 35 homes, Forest Hills Preserve on the east side of Forest Lake off of North Shore there. They actually poured curb and gutter today, so quick easy math, takes 7 days. Well, projecting the weather that we got coming too, might be a week out, but once we get the blacktop down, you'll start seeing building permits pulled for that area now too. So word on the street is there's some pretty nice houses coming in there, so we'll see what they propose on building permit. So you really got something going on everywhere within the city. MnDOT's obviously working on Highway 97 stuff, and they plan to engage City Council, the public, potentially starting as early this winter on what they're moving forward with that area. So, you know, all this stuff that we talked about, Dan's talked about, you guys kind of talked about, really when these transportation projects get done and open the gate, that's when stuff flows, and it's coming. So, you guys' lot prices are so much lower than just Blaine, you know, so they want to come here. And then you have the schools that have done all the improvements that they've just recently done, and what they've done in classrooms. The charter schools, you know, are obviously growing, and all that stuff is why people want to move here. So we just got to keep moving forward. Is that enough?
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Ryan. All right. That being the end of our agenda, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion, we adjourn.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.